We tend to dislike mysteries. We feel uncomfortable not knowing. The more that we know, the less we bend, the more brittle we become, the easier to break.
That wasn't an act of God. Wasn't it? It's okay to just look at the world and say, why, I don't understand. Why?
We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings and welcome to the Anadromist. This is Byrne Power, your host from Tbilisi, Georgia. And today what we're going to do is something that I probably need to do a bit more of. I do watch a lot of films and I read a lot of books and I listen to a lot of music, but to date I haven't done much in the way of cultural reviews or analysis of these things. And so what I want to do today is I recently had a chance to watch the Netflix series Midnight Mass, which I recommend if you want to be challenged. It is a very challenging series. Only 7 episodes. It's not going to continue forever. So if you have a Netflix subscription or you know another way around the internet, you should give it a watch. But I will say this. This is not going to be simply a review. I am going to totally ruin the plot of this series. Because there's a lot that it brings up, and I don't want to be cutesy and just kind of like let you feel like, ooh, I wonder what's going to happen. I want to discuss certain aspects of it. So, we're going to watch a lot of clips. I'm probably going to get hit so hardly on copyright claims on this, but it's mostly from one place. So, I don't care. I don't make any money on this anyway, because I'm living in Georgia, not the state, the country, somewhere in the middle of the world. It's impossible for me to monetize my videos, even though I have enough of everything to do so. So what I do recommend, if you want to support this channel, though, I don't have a Patreon account, but I do have a PayPal link below. Use that. And also, share the video if you like it. Subscribe if you haven't. You can hit like. That helps the blind idiot gods of the algorithms. And you may not like what I have to say about this this series. That's fine. You may like it indeed. That's fine. And you can leave comments. and to the one person who is always, there's a person who will give me a thumbs down on anything. To that one person I say, just remember, even the thumbs down counts as engagement to YouTube, and that's kind of a thumbs up for me. So, thanks. Let's get into Midnight Mass, directed by Mike Flanagan on Netflix. So let's dive into Midnight Mass. And again, this is a Netflix 7-part series, directed, created by Mike Flanagan. I would consider Mike Flanagan perhaps the premier horror director of our times. And only James Wan is probably giving him competition. But both of them go back to a similar period, late 90s, early aughts. This is his third series for Netflix. He also did The Haunting of Hill House in 2018 and The Haunting of Bly Manor in 2020. And The Haunting of Hill House, his version of the Shirley Jackson novel, is considered pretty highly by people who know their horror literature and horror films. There was an earlier version of this, The Haunting, and that was done by Robert Wise back in the early 60s. I think that was 1961. I haven't got it tooled up just at the moment. This just occurred to me. And also there was a typical late 90s version of The Haunting of Hill House, which was a movie with all sorts of digital insanity going on. That's worth looking at. But Mike Flanagan's version is much longer, in a sense. It was a multi-part series than the novel. But that tells you something about his trajectory. Let's talk about Mike Flanagan for a moment. Mike Flanagan was born in 1978 in Salem, Massachusetts, to a Catholic family. It's a very Irish last name. And he was Catholic educated for quite a while throughout his life. His father was in the military, and so he traveled a bit, ending up in Maryland, where he did a lot of his formative teen years. He is known in his films for certain hallmarks of their work, and mirrors show up quite often in his work. I think part of the reason he liked doing these haunted house stories was because they have mirrors. You have an old house, you got to have old weird mirrors in the house, and that's a good place to have some sort of strange shenanigans go on. And there's a whole study to be done on great mirrors in movies, going back to the mirror in the British film from the 1940s, Dead of Night has one of the scariest mirrors. And then there was a series that came out about 20 years ago. There was Mirrors with Kiefer Sutherland, and then Mirrors number 2, if you needed more. And mirrors have often shown up in that sort of Alice in Wonderland way, where you look through them and you see a different world than the one you live in. Unlike Alice in Wonderland, mirrors can also have a dark spiritual side to them as well. Another theme that runs throughout his work is his interaction with his wife, Kate Siegel, who has appeared in, we'll say, about 4/5 of his work. And in this film in particular, I feel like it's a dialogue that he's been having with his wife for quite a while. She's Jewish. He is Catholic. I don't think either of them are, shall we say, really observant Jews or really religious Catholic. Nevertheless, there is definitely a past of heritage that they are both working on, and one kind of feels the tension in his films. He did some short films, including a short version of his idea Oculus being a movie about mirrors. It got noticed, but, all he was able to do is make a very cheap film, and I noticed this when it first came out. It was called Absentia. Very effective, very cheap little thriller set in Los Angeles, filmed in his house. Keep that in mind. That was 2011, but by 2013 he was able to make a slightly bigger budget horror film. It was called Oculus. It was about haunted mirrors. A very, very, very wonderfully scary work. His next film was called Hush in 2016. Also, he did a sequel, actually a prequel. Don't you hate that word? There was a kind of a lo-fi film called Ouija, and it made money for the Blumhouse people, so they said make a sequel, and he made Ouija: Origin of Evil, which everyone says, much better film. You didn't need the original one after seeing this one. And then he did the Stephen King story, Gerald's Game, which essentially is, we'll say, a 1 3/4 actor piece. I won't go into it. It's something you should watch someday, but it features Carla Gugino, who I've been noticing for years, and she really gives a tour de force performance in that of essentially women suffering. And then it was followed by the Netflix Haunting of Hill House series, the Shirley Jackson novel, and that was really successful. So those two things bumped him up a notch to the point where in 2019 he was able to give his follow-up, and oh my, what a film to try to follow up, to The Shining. He's following up both Stephen King and Stanley Kubrick, and what he did was pretty amazing. He actually managed to pay tribute to both of them because, and this is an interesting thing, Stephen King famously really disliked Stanley Kubrick's version of The Shining, and there's a great anecdote Stephen King told where he was woken up in the middle of the night by Stanley Kubrick, who famously refused to fly anymore in his life. He had flown just too many times, so he no longer would fly across the oceans. And he calls him up in the middle of the night to discuss The Shining, and basically all he says is, "So Stephen, do you believe in God?" And Stephen, kind of, groggy with sleep, goes, "Yeah, I do." And he goes like, "Yeah, I don't." And I think he just hangs up, which tells you the difference between Stephen King's view of the world and Stanley Kubrick's. But somehow Mike Flanagan managed to pull the two together. It's not, of course, the film can't be as respected as The Shining. That's considered by many people to be one of the great horror films ever made. I'm a little less excited about it, but that's a long story. But nevertheless, he managed to put those two views together in this film, which was a feat all in itself. Then in 2020, the Annus Horribilis, he came out with The Haunting of Bly Manor. And I think that Netflix was kind of wanting a new haunting film from him every other year or so, haunting series. So he didn't actually direct all of this. He created this, and then he directed the first episode, but he left the rest of it to other people and mostly produced it. But this was based on Henry James' Turn of the Screw. That was regarded with some success. I thought it much lesser than The Haunting of Hill House, and I thought that the Henry James themes were not really brought out as well as they could have been. And then there was a problem, which I think also goes into this work. That one had a kind of a politically correct ending, which I don't like it when you take classic literature and then try to turn it into something to reflect who we are now, especially when who we are now flatly contradicts what was originally written. But that does bring us to Midnight Mass. And Midnight Mass I think, is really worth a watch. It is a very challenging piece. It's not without its faults, but at the same time, I think it's an honest piece of work from him, and he directed the entire 7-part series. Let me put it this way. This whole series can be seen, this story can be seen as being inspired by Stephen King's works. You have a small island that I think was originally supposed to be set off the coast of New England, in Maine or Massachusetts. And it's really reminiscent in many ways of Stephen King's Storm of the Century. Now, in Stephen King's The Storm of the Century, You have a mysterious figure who comes into this town to make the townsfolk an offer they can't refuse. And I'm going to talk about that more. Oh, by the way, did I mention, I probably did already, that I'm going to spoil the hell out of this whole story, because I'm not interested in reviewing it. I'm interested in getting into the ideas of the story. Interestingly enough, there are shots of the island from overhead that are kind of reminiscent of the Bodega Bay shots in Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds. Now, one of my big problems with the series, and I'm going to say it now, and I'm not going to talk about it much more, because I think it reflects the problems of film and television making today. Is, first of all, you've got a mandatory diversity cast. In Hollywood, for some reason, you can no longer have a group of people who are all one kind of people. That is to say, now, I've lived in the Pacific Northwest, where this film was actually shot. It was actually shot on an island near, in the Vancouver area off the coast of Canada. But that's very similar to the area I lived in Alaska, in Southeast Alaska, which is all part of the whole Pacific Northwest zone. Now, I can tell you with great certainty that these towns do not have extremely diverse groups of people. They will often have one kind of person, largely white, European related. I mean, in a town like Petersburg, Alaska, almost everyone's Norwegian. And if you're not Norwegian, it's kind of a problem. But if you're going to have another group of people of a different ethnicity, it's going to be largely Native American or First Nations Canadian. And I've got a problem immediately as soon as you throw a diverse cast into a small island that's supposed to be like New England's got the same issues. The small little communities off the coasts of Maine and such are going to have a lot of the same issues. So, of course, kind of your mandatory lesbians. You've got Muslim sheriff. Muslim sheriff. In fact, one of the things I do like about this is that much is made of the fact that the guy is Muslim and a sheriff. And in fact, there is one character who keeps calling him Sharif. I could excuse that. I mean, that such a thing would ever happen in a small town off the coast of either side of the continent would be almost unthinkable. Not because of prejudice, but simply because in my entire time living in Alaska, people with Middle Eastern background, not really there. Why? Look at the weather. Then look at the Middle East. Do people who, I'm living in Georgia right now. Georgians generally don't want to go to someplace that's really cold, wet, and rainy. And that's what those places are. I mean, you get people who generally come from cultures where they don't mind that. And of course, there are various shades of color in our mandatory casting, which again, I haven't got a problem with. I mean, there was one series about a mermaid where they had actually someone who was supposed to be native being played by someone who was from Somalia. And I'm sitting there going like, you couldn't find a Native American? You don't know what they look like? I mean, granted, this was a light-skinned Somali, but and I think that people are so nervous about showing. I mean, if you look at all of the older Stephen King movies and television series based on his main stuff, they're almost all white. I mean, you might get the occasional black character, the occasional character who is gay or LGBT or whatever. But the point is, I mean, in Alaska, it's just not that big a deal. You don't run into that many people. The real diversity is going to be in backgrounds of people. So where I lived in Alaska, you had, for instance, the original natives. But even the natives, there were two kinds. I mean, they were both the same Tlingit tribe, but they were two kinds. Then you would have people related to the earliest settlers in the area, which only goes back 100 years or so. Then you have people who are related maybe to the military base. that was in this little town, the first army base in Alaska. I'm just talking about Alaska now, but these kind of things hold true. You're going to find one kind of group of people, but then you're going to find all these divisions. So then there were hippies that came up to get away from, the big ugly cities in the 70s and 80s. Older, aging hippies, we'll call them, who then had children and such. Then you're going to have people coming to work with tourism and guides and such like that. And then you're going to have high school students who are in a totally different environment. And then weirdos like me who don't fit into anything. And let's see, number of black people I can remember in Haines, Alaska, not many. Maybe a couple of handfuls over 22 years. People of Hispanic descent, a few more, but there's no Hispanic culture. Very little. Try to find food. Few people of Asian descent. I wish we had better restaurants and such. There were some Thai people who had gotten married to men who lived in Alaska, and there's a whole story there that's interesting. But essentially, the basic drama of these towns take place in essentially cultures that are not considered diverse enough. These cultures actually have a lot of diversity, but it's not the same kind of diversity. Now, the other problem here is that it's very clear that the worst person in this movie is a Christian. And she's a fanatic Catholic, and Catholicism is very important to this. And I think one of the things, and now we're going to talk more about the themes of the and the influences of this piece. I'm not going to spell out all of the plot, because you really should watch it. And even if you're listening to this, I am going to ruin a lot for you, but what I'm not going to go over is what happened first, what happened second. I'm going to leave it all jumbled up for you so that if you do watch it, or if you have watched it, you'll know what I'm talking about. But if you do watch it, these are themes to look out for and things to think about. So even though the worst person in here is a woman and a Christian, I think that fortunately, there are other people who are also Christian who balance it off. So he hasn't quite created a straw woman here. He has indeed, and the woman who does the acting here is a recognizable type in churches. And that is to say, the kind of person who likes to control the direction the church is going, and clearly comes from his own observations of being a Catholic as he was growing up. But in a way, Catholicism here is seen as being like a folk religion. And what do I mean by that? I mean that it's just something that all the people on the island kind of are connected to. Although in the beginning, and this is what's really interesting about this, is that the church, the main Catholic church on this island, is a pretty dead place. I mean, very few people are coming to it. And one day, a young priest shows up, and he's charismatic. He gives sermons that range from being actually pretty good to eventually being very scary. But they're not scary in the usual way that sermons and homilies are scary in movies about Protestants. In movies about Protestants, usually they get scary when people start talking about going to hell and you're a sinner and stuff like that. Not that I find that to be a problem for any movie dealing with Christian themes. It's the way it's presented. It's presented in such a way as we're all winking our eyes. We know this person's wrong. We know better. God loves us. God wouldn't judge us. And that's how we feel. Whereas in this one, it's a lot more complex. And I think one of the reasons I really like this, and the reason I decided to actually make a video on this, is because he really is setting up something which is really complex to deal with. It's not a simple thing. He's got like I said, there are a few little quibbles I have, mostly dealing with my problems with Hollywood at the moment. But in fact, I think Mike Flanagan is really trying to deal with these things in a serious way, because he's actually had the idea for this going back way back into his career. He originally wanted to make a movie out of this, and then he wanted to write a novel, and then he wanted to make try the movie idea again, and then he ended up as finally getting the series made after a lot of attempts.
Midnight Mass has been in my head since before I had a career. The idea of a Catholic parish in an isolated community that appears to be going through some kind of miraculous religious revival, that's what came first. I was raised Roman Catholic in a small town. I was an altar boy in Midnight Mass. That was a pretty big deal. It's candlelight and its darkness is kind of one of the witching hours. That was what was so exciting about it as a supernatural horror show.
Faith is a signpost to who you are, so is what you fear. And the show takes a hard look at both those things.
I think this is something that he really wanted to try to do. This is him wrestling with his faith as he was growing up versus what he thinks now. And also in consort with his dialogues with his wife. And one of the things I see is that his films are often this dialogue with his wife, and you can really feel this by the end of it.
This community is in the midst of a full-blown religious revival at the moment. And if the children of this community cannot discuss that in their local school, well, I just don't know what that is.
I couldn't stay in that room listening to her bullshit one more minute. It's like this particular brand of self-righteousness that is exclusive to a certain breed of religious. And I've never liked that. Never. Sorry, that was... How are you? How's it going?
And also, if you just look at a picture of Mike Flanagan and then look at some of the people, some of the men he chooses as focal characters, they kind of look like him.
Riley is kind of my avatar in the story. Back in the days when I drank, there were times where I felt like the consequences weren't going to apply to me.
Everybody has a moment in their life where risky behavior meets good luck or bad luck. Riley's just happened to go terribly wrong.
And for me, that was always the really scary thing. I wanted very much to try to tell a story wherein I would authentically try to inhabit both perspectives that exist within me about faith and about religion, to see where I came out.
The ethos of the show is to ask questions, not give answers. Those questions should really stay with you if we've done our jobs right.
Yeah, so Catholicism is like a folk religion. You can see this at the end, where everyone on the island in this final conflagration at the very end is singing "Nearer, My God, to Thee," which I think is like, really? Could that many people sing "Nearer, My God, to Thee" without a hymn book? Maybe. I don't know how often it's sung in Catholic churches. In Protestant churches, it tends to be really low on, circulation of which hymns are sung. And most people know it from the Titanic movie, or just they played this or sang this as the Titanic was going down. Also, there's a scene in here set in the desert which harkens back to The Exorcist. If you remember, at the beginning of The Exorcist, there is a scene there which involves a demon and involves the desert winds and things like this. And there is definitely a hearkening to this sort of thing. Another folk religion in this, and it's almost put together as one-on-one with Catholicism, is AA, Alcoholics Anonymous. And there's an AA group that is a central feature in this series. Interesting that, again, it's almost like both of these are folk religions. They are civic religions, more than they are actual religions. That is, what do I mean by that? I mean that a person who really has faith, and the people I've met in my life who really seem to have faith in God, faith in Christ, don't walk around like they don't know what they're doing. I mean, they walk around humbly, they recognize their sinfulness, this sort of thing. So often in scenes in movies, I mean, I really felt this when watching Martin Scorsese's Last Temptation of Christ. You know you're in trouble when you feel you've got more faith than the Christ character on the screen, which is how I felt. And I don't feel like I'm any sort of hero of the faith or anything. I just felt like, well, come on, Jesus, Willem Dafoe, just believe this. Do what you got to do. You got to have some faith here. But I think that's because for a lot of people, faith is this really super spiritual thing that kind of floats around. No one can define it. Whereas in fact, it's trust and commitment, and it takes time to develop. There is a scene in this film which is kind of reminiscent of Jonestown to a high degree. And is Mike Flanagan suggesting that everyone's in a cult like Jonestown here? I don't think so. I think what he's really suggesting is that, and this is where it goes back to Stephen King's Storm of the Century. In Storm of the Century, there is the demon Linoge who comes to the town to ask for a disciple. And he eventually creates such havoc in the town that they have a town meeting where they have to choose whether to give the demon what he wants or to suffer the destruction of much, much more of the town. And this all takes place during this massive storm. Interestingly enough, in the first couple of episodes of this film, there is a storm. One of the storm's results is to leave everyone stranded on the island. So you have this very Stephen King-esque stuck on a fishing island kind of plot going on here with a demonic character. Oh, by the way, the Jonestown stuff has a lot to do with rat poison, which was actually a very good substitute. It's liquid rat poison for the cyanide that was put into the Kool-Aid type drink that was the main staple at Jonestown at the end. But what's interesting about this vampire, we're talking about vampires now. And here's where I'm going to totally blow the whole plot for you, because a lot of people are going to be wondering, is it a demon or is it a vampire? And the answer to the question is, it's both.
Faith! Just a few minutes, just a few moments, really? The body is dead, but just for a moment. The resurrection of the body. That's what Easter is about. That is what we are about to witness. Sheriff, please. Behold. Lo and behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to them, and they were afraid.
Evidently, in the world of the film, just as in The Walking Dead, no one's ever heard the word zombie before, and so no one uses the word. In this film, no one seems to have heard either the word vampire or demon. And the central character is essentially both. Now, when you finally see the character, and I'll keep this aside, I won't show him to you. I'll show you a little bit of the back of him, but I'm not going to give you a really full-on view of him in this video. But when you see the character, he is remarkably similar to Gustave Doré's 19th century depiction of the devil tempting Jesus in the wilderness. And this devil has kind of bat wings. I am sure Mike Flanagan saw this, or if Mike Flanagan didn't, the person who designed it did. And because it's very much this kind of bat demon creature. People are getting infected in this film, and they are essentially acting like vampires. It's not every bit of vampire lore. No one brings in, the crosses. Crosses don't seem to have a problem at all for these vampires. Nobody brings in the garlic. They don't have to sleep in a crypt at night. But The main element is the sun, and the sun is deadly for them. One of the problems that the film highlights, and I think it's a very interesting one, and it's the same kind of thing that Anne Rice highlighted in Interview with a Vampire, is that what is eternal life as a vampire? Now, this film poses it in a different way, because these people can't fly, so they need to take a boat to get off the island. And what we're seeing here, and now, again, another thing I'm just going to totally ruin for the film, is that essentially it becomes a vampire town, where everyone at the end is a vampire, starting with the one preacher who comes. What's interesting about it is, though, because they can't turn into bats and fly away, all the people who are vampires feed on all the people who aren't, or at least are looking for them. And you have this problem of, if the world was made of vampires, you would get to a point where eventually there's no one left to feed on. And they get to this point very quickly in the film. And in fact, one of the biggest problems is they have to use boats to get off the island. I'm not going to explain what happens in relationship to that, but you can start in your mind going through a variety of scenarios. One of the interesting things also relates to time and aging.
If you follow me, if you follow us, if you follow him, he will raise you again in his glory to eternal life. There is a price to be paid for everlasting life, as there was for our Savior. And each one of us will have the opportunity tonight to pay that price. But first, and I know after everything we've been through together, this is not easy to believe. So I invite you, as Jesus invited Thomas, to witness for yourself. Sturge.
And one of the things that this demon vampire gives to people through its infection, in a sense, it's also an infection movie as well. But one of the things that he gives is he lets people go back to a time in their life where it is seen that they are at their best. So, turns out that did I say I was going to ruin this? It turns out that the main priest is actually their old aging priest who was sent off to Jerusalem on a trip by the congregation near the end of his life just to finally get to see the Holy Land. But when he comes back, he is in the full prime of his youth. That's really fascinating. And in a way, it's seen as it's a distortion of what is often imagined about heaven. And strangely, though, becoming more youthful starts to be seen as a curse. It's not simply that, oh, goody, I get to be youthful again. You're youthful with all the stuff going on in your mind that you remember from the past, and yet you've become healthy again. But it's not a good thing. It's seen as something very dark. So the whole town becomes infected with the demonic vampire plague. Now, here's a couple of things about this that a lot of people don't realize. What Mike Flanagan is really doing is referring back to an EC Comics Tales from the Crypt story called Midnight Mess. And it's about a town that is essentially become vampiric. This man has come to visit his sister. And when he comes, people are saying, you know, the sun is going down. You should get off the streets. You should get off the streets. He decides to eat at a local restaurant. And they keep saying to him, are you going to be leaving soon? It's getting dark. He finally gets to his sister's house, and she's glad he's there. And she can't believe that he's come so close to dark. But she says, well, just stay in the house. Don't go out. And he says, you don't believe all this stuff. And he goes, yes, they're vampires. And he goes like, really? He goes like, I can't believe it. Anyway, in the middle of the night, he kind of wakes up. He's got a lot of stuff on his mind. Goes for a walk. And he sees that the restaurant is open, full of business. And so he goes in. And he discovers, to his chagrin, that his sister and everyone else in the, not everyone, but most of the other people in the town have become vampires. And they hang out at this restaurant and they drain the life of people. And of course, they finally, the sister basically says, hey, there's nothing we can do about this. So you have this 1950s Tales from the Crypt, EC Comics story called about a vampire town called Midnight Mass. This is called Midnight Mass. And like I say, Mike Flanagan knows his horror literature. He knows the classics. You can't have gotten through reading enough stuff. I mean, even if you just read, what influenced Stephen King, one of the big names that pops up is EC Comics. I am sure Mike Flanagan knows exactly what he's doing. And in fact, the name Midnight Mass shows up in a book in his 2016 film Hush. And then again, in his 2017 Stephen King adaptation, Gerald's Game. And so he's been thinking about this for a while. He knows this stuff. One of the central characters of the town is turned into a vampire, but doesn't want to be, and allows himself to be killed in the sun. Now, what's interesting is that this character, to me, is the stand-in for Mike Flanagan. And he is a Catholic, used to be an altar boy, lost his faith, is doubting everything, but yet trying to connect, trying to find his faith, and yet he feels there's something really wrong with this priest who comes in, who seems to be reinvigorating everyone, and yet something is going on here that he feels uncomfortable with. There's another woman who finds herself growing younger, doesn't know why, who turns out to have a connection with the priest, and she feels there's something wrong with him. Yet, and here's what's really interesting, and yet, one of the things that's happening, and I find this to be the central, it's like the mystery at the heart of this thing, because the horror stuff you can understand. But one of the strangest parts of this is that there is a miracle scene in the middle of this story. And it is a miracle scene that, in my mind, took me back to Lon Chaney back in the 1920s, who more than once did films where a miracle occurs. There's one where essentially what happens, and it's just all we have is a fragment of this film now. What happens is Lon Chaney is playing a huckster. He is playing someone who is, and there's a miracle worker who's pretending to be a Christian. And Lon Chaney, the great silent actor, is pretending to be healed. Now, Lon Chaney could twist himself up like a pretzel in such contortions that you would swear, my God, this guy is completely, is just so wounded and bruised and crippled. And in the middle of the scene, so he starts to demonstrate that he is being healed. So he has this whole shtick, this whole con game where he's pretending to be healed so that people will give the preacher money. And what happens in the middle of it is that there's a child who is in crutches who is genuinely healed. And this just upsets everything, because in the middle of this story about crime and con games, a miracle breaks out. And something like that happens here. Especially when you look back at the film after knowing it. There's a scene where there's a miracle. And if you remember, the demon vampire takes you back to your, in a sense, your best self. And so this one young girl is healed. And I'm not going to spoil all what happens with her story, but it's a fascinating moment in this. And I think one of the themes of this series is that it's asking the questions about dying churches. And I think there are many dying churches in America. There is a world which is slipping away, a world of Sunday go-to meeting, a world of Sunday potlucks at churches, of local communities. Our communities are being essentially eviscerated by our technology. They're being eviscerated by our philosophical outlooks, which tend to put all the emphasis upon our individuality and individual freedom to the expense of our community life. And I don't mean, when I say community life, I don't mean, our, internet Star Wars community. I don't mean the black community. These are much too abstract or too big to really matter. I'm talking about physical people living in proximity geographically who have a connection in time and space and fulfill different functions within a community. And our churches are reflection of the real grave issues that are afflicting both our community lives and are afflicting our church lives. And I have been to churches that I just feel like, why are we doing this? Not because I disagree with faith, but because the faith has been replaced by things that are done that are just simply rote, and then new things come in like new music or, new techniques, but they're done with so little care. I think one of the reasons there's an Orthodox, big O Orthodox revival going on in America is because or North America, because it's Canada too, it's because when you go into an Orthodox church, there are no screens on the wall projecting the lyrics to songs, no PowerPoint presentations. Essentially, it's just church and people and icons and things like that. But so many churches have been trapped in the times. And I think that this is a fascinating look at the problems of dying churches. And then you throw into it a leader who is suddenly charismatic, who suddenly has some way of communicating that attracts people. And then you start going to the mega church phenomena. And essentially, this town itself becomes a mini mega church. Now, what's interesting is the central character of the priest here is very much someone who, I think he starts off being his old self. And he realizes that he has to help people to find life, to find real life. And I don't think he's sure that his new youthful state is finding real life. And I think he has some doubts about what is happening to himself. Nevertheless, he wants to help the people in his community. So he's doing something with them, with the help of this most troubling parishioner of his, to help convert them. By the end, he is starting to question the demonic influence. And I think, and here's what I really do think this, I think when churches go from the troubling little funky church that doesn't know what it's doing, and something happens where they start to mutate into the large mega church with all the screens and the amplifiers and the rock bands and stuff, somewhere in that process, something else takes over. I think that it's very easy for those kind of churches to go off the rails and become essentially just a consumer experience more than a genuine experience of faith. Now, I think that kind of thought is in here. However, this is not this does not end up, again, the central character, male character, who, like I say, seems to be a lot like Mike Flanagan himself in certain ways, is a character who always remains doubtful. He has some place left for faith, but he is doubtful. I imagine Mike Flanagan is like that in his own life. But he gives the final benediction to his wife's character, Kate Siegel, in this film. And what it is, it's like a Zen interpretation of Carl Sagan's kind of mindless universe, but with a pinch of Hebrew salt at the end. Let's watch that scene.
Myself. That's the problem. That's the whole problem with the whole thing. That word. Self. That's not the word. That's not right. That isn't. How did I forget that? When did I forget that? The body stops a cell at a time, but the brain keeps firing those neurons. Little lightning bolts like fireworks inside, and I thought I'd despair or feel afraid, but I don't feel any of that. None of it. Because I'm too busy. I'm too busy in this moment, remembering. Of course. I remember that every atom in my body was forged in a star. This matter, this body is mostly just empty space, after all, and solid matter, it's just energy vibrating very slowly, and there is no me. There never was. The electrons of my body mingle and dance with the electrons of the ground below me and the air. I'm no longer breathing. And I remember. There is no point where any of that ends and I begin. I remember I am energy, not memory, not self. My name, my personality, my choices all came after me. I was before them, and I will be after, and everything else is pictures, picked up along the way. Fleeting little dreamlets, printed on the tissue of my dying brain. And I am the lightning that jumps between. I am the energy firing the neurons, and I'm returning. Just by remembering, I'm returning home. It's like a drop of water falling back into the ocean, of which it's always been a part. All things, a part. All of us, a part. You, me, and my little girl, and my mother, and my father. Everyone who's ever been. Every plant, every animal, every atom, every star, every galaxy, all of it. More galaxies in the universe than grains of sand on the beach, and that's what we're talking about when we say God. The One. The cosmos and its infinite dreams. We are the cosmos dreaming of itself. It's simply a dream that I think is my life every time. But I'll forget this. I always do. I always forget my dreams. But now, in this split second, in the moment I remember, the instant I remember, I comprehend everything at once. There is no time. There is no death. Life is a dream. It's a wish. Made again and again and again and again and again and again and on into eternity. And I am all of it. I am everything. I am all. I am that I am.
And that's what appears to some people as very honest, that we finally realize we're just the earth. We are everything. It's all connected. Well, this is very much kind of a new agey thought. But like I say, that pinch of I am what I am, the Hebrew conception of God thrown in at the end. No, I don't think God is an old man in the sky. But nor do I think the Bible ever, ever, ever presented God that way. But I do think that, in a sense, what this is saying is beware of the charismatic leader, beware of the easy version of faith, beware of the bigoted version of faith, which would, of course, be a staple of what Jonathan Peugeot calls parasitic storytelling. And in Jonathan Peugeot's idea of parasitic storytelling, you always need to take an existing type of story and then change the message. And I think in many ways, and this is a criticism, that what Mike Flanagan has done here is taken the Stephen King story, taken the Catholic Church story, and up until about halfway through this, you're tending to think, oh, this could genuinely be about faith, particularly the miracle scene. And then by the end, it becomes more about this generalized, people say things like, I guess the universe just didn't want me to go down the street because, there was some sort of construction work in the way. I guess the universe brought you to me. And the universe being this vague, non-personal idea of God. And yet, if there is a God, God would have to certainly be greater than I am. My personality would, if there's no God, my personality is the most fluky thing in the universe. It's either just an illusion or it's complete fluke. Whereas I think it reflects the universe that God made. And God has personality far, far, far greater than not only I do, obviously, or you do, but that the entire mass of humanity and creation does. Now, I can interpret this whole thing in a very different way. I can interpret this like this. There's the scene in the movie where the priest gives a speech and he talks about the need for a new morality. To which I'm sitting there saying, new morality? I think C.S. Lewis once said, we can no more invent a new morality than we can invent a new primary color. Really, this isn't the people going insane at the end. The people who have turned totally into vampires, they aren't becoming Christians. They aren't becoming good Catholics. They are becoming, the woke, really. Because who's trying to invent a new morality here in our culture? It's not the people who are just saying, leave me alone, I just want to live. Kind of libertarian thing. It's not the old school Christians of Catholic, Orthodox, or Protestant. It is, in fact, the people who think that since the 1960s, there are new possibilities. We can live totally differently than we've ever lived in the past. And technology allows it. And in a sense, the preacher is being swayed by his own words, swayed by the possibility of the miraculous, swayed by the possibility of, fighting time. And I don't know if Mike Flanagan put this in on purpose as a way of questioning some of his own beliefs, but it certainly does. Although in the end is a bit like the end of Lost. If you remember the Lost TV series, which the end let everyone down because, it just kind of was. There used to be this book back in the 1960s called The Family of Man, and it just showed a little bit of this religion, a little bit of that religion, young children here, young children there, and how we're all one. It's like there's no real problems, and in the end, we'll all go to whatever paradise we imagine, and which is how Lost ends. It's just kind of like everyone goes to their own little heaven or whatever, which is how this ends, where at the final scene, everyone's praying, or handling things the way that they see fit to handle, which is not the worst thing in the world, but it's weak. It just doesn't say anything, and I think there was more being said in other parts of this. I think basically it's a very hard thing to end, though. This film does have hope, because the central creature can't live in the light. And the light is coming, and it's on an island, and it's trying to fly, and it's probably not going to get to where it's trying to go before the light eats it up. If you haven't seen the series, I pretty much ruined it for you, although I did save a lot of plot points for you, so you can be surprised. But I wanted to get you the central, gospel of blood. Indeed. Christianity as vampire, Christianity as demonic. But like I said in the commentary, it's not as simple as that. I think Mike Flanagan is not merely attacking Christianity. He's dealing with something inside of himself. And I think he's made an honest piece, even though there are places I obviously disagreed with him. And I recommend watching it if you're a Christian and want to wrestle with your faith. It's a good thing to do. If you're not a Christian and want to wrestle with all this stuff, if you're a bit of a horror weenie, I probably scared you enough in this video, so you can live with that. Well, again, like, share, subscribe, all that stuff. Contribute through PayPal. And thanks for coming around. And leave a comment. Let me know what you thought. And remember, Anadromous is a word applied to salmon predominantly, but other fish as well. And it means, you've gone out and now you're swimming back against the stream to go home. We'll meet again.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.
We hope that the audience will have some things to think about afterwards. And we hope to scare the hell out of you.